A weapon so devastating, so utterly dominant on the battlefield, that enemy commanders broke into a cold sweat at its mere mention. A steel predator, engineered for one purpose, to hunt and obliterate the most formidable armored beasts the world had ever seen. During the crucible of the great global conflict, the Allied forces forged just such a machine, a true legend, feared by its adversaries, revered by its crews. It single-handedly turned the tide in countless desperate engagements, clearing paths, smashing fortifications, and annihilating the most advanced enemy tanks with impunity. Yet, as the smoke cleared and victory parades filled the streets, this titan of war, this undisputed champion, was not celebrated, not integrated, not even preserved in significant numbers. Instead, it was systematically, unceremoniously, and almost inexplicably, dismantled. Vanished. Why? What dark secret or strategic oversight led to the swift abandonment of America's deadliest armored weapon after it had delivered such a decisive triumph? The answer is more complex, more intriguing, and perhaps more unsettling than you could ever imagine. Stick around, because the truth behind its disappearance will shock you. The early days of the great global conflict were a brutal awakening for the Allied powers. The forces of the Eastern Coalition, spearheaded by their fearsome Goliath tanks, were tearing through the Western Front like a hot knife through butter. These hulking behemoths, clad in thick, sloped armor and armed with devastating cannons, seemed all but invincible. Standard Allied armored vehicles, primarily the agile Sentinel light tanks and the moderately armed Defender medium tanks, were simply outmatched, their shells often bouncing harmlessly off the enemy's hardened hides. Morale plummeted as tank crews faced impossible odds, often succumbing to the superior firepower and protection of the coalition's armored divisions. The tactical landscape was dire, demanding an immediate and decisive response. The call went out across the industrial heartland of the Western Commonwealth: design a tank destroyer. Design something that could not just fight, but dominate these mechanical monsters. From this desperate necessity, a new breed of war machine was conceived. Engineers and metallurgists worked tirelessly, fueled by coffee and patriotic fervor, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible in armored warfare. They knew they couldn't simply up-armor an existing design. The Goliath tanks were too fast and too heavily gunned. A different philosophy was required: speed, precision, and overwhelming offensive power. The result was a radical departure from conventional tank design. Nicknamed the Wraith Hunter by its early development teams, and later officially designated the M18 Thunderbolt by military brass, this vehicle was a marvel of minimalist engineering. Its open-top turret, a concession made to reduce weight and production time, housed an incredibly potent 76mm high-velocity cannon, specifically designed to penetrate the thickest coalition armor. Its revolutionary torsion bar suspension system provided unparalleled speed and agility, allowing it to flank and outmaneuver even the swiftest enemy armor. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to slug it out toe-to-toe like a heavy tank. It was a predator, a sniper on treads. Its doctrine emphasized shoot and scoot, hit-and-run tactics that exploited its superior speed. Its armor, while thinner than its adversaries, was deemed sufficient to protect against small arms fire and shrapnel, relying instead on not being hit at all. Early trials were spectacular. Test ranges in the arid plains of New Arcadia echoed with the roar of its engine and the explosive crack of its main gun as it effortlessly perforated captured Goliath hulls. The crews, initially skeptical of its light protection, quickly became evangelists, praising its incredible mobility and lethal punch. They learned to use terrain, speed, and surprise as their primary defense. When the first Thunderbolts rolled off the assembly lines and into the war zones, their impact was immediate and profound. On the ravaged plains of the Argonne sector and in the bitter fighting for the Ardennes Heights, these nimble killers turned the tide of numerous engagements. Allied infantry, previously terrified of Goliath advances, found new hope as Thunderbolts appeared seemingly out of nowhere, delivering precise, devastating blows to enemy formations before vanishing back into cover. Stories quickly spread of individual Thunderbolt crews racking up multiple Goliath kills in a single day, transforming the psychological battlefield. The coalition forces, once confident in their armored superiority, now spoke of the whispering death, the unseen hunter that could strike from any direction, leaving behind only smoking wreckage. The Thunderbolt had not just entered the war, it had fundamentally changed how it was fought, becoming the undisputed champion of the Allied anti-tank effort. Its reputation was forged in fire, its legend undeniable. With the Thunderbolt now firmly entrenched on the front lines, the Allied forces began to truly exploit its unique capabilities. It was integrated into specialized hunter-killer battalions, often operating ahead of the main armored thrusts or deployed as rapid response units to counter enemy breakthroughs. These units became notorious for their aggressive, almost audacious tactics. Unlike traditional tank units that advanced in formations, Thunderbolt crews were trained to operate with a degree of independence, seeking out high ground, ambush points, and vulnerable flanks. Their radio chatter was filled with calls for hunter's advantage and flanking maneuvers, a stark contrast to the methodical commands heard from slower, heavier tank divisions. One particularly notable deployment occurred during the desperate defense of the River Eldoria crossings. A massive coalition armored column, spearheaded by a new variant of the Goliath, the formidable ironclad, was attempting to force a passage, threatening to split the Allied lines. The few remaining Defender medium tanks were quickly overwhelmed. It looked like a catastrophic collapse was imminent. Then, out of the dense forest bordering the river, a squadron of Thunderbolts, commanded by the legendary Captain Ghost Thorn, materialized. Instead of engaging head-on, Thorn's units executed a daring flanking maneuver, using their superior speed to race around the advancing ironclads. They unleashed a torrent of high-velocity shells into the softer side and rear armor of the enemy tanks, causing chaos and confusion. One ironclad after another erupted in flames, its heavy armor proving useless against the precise, devastating strikes. The Thunderbolt's impact wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Eastern Coalition propaganda machine had long trumpeted the invincibility of their Goliath tanks. The appearance of the Thunderbolts shattered this myth. Pilots flying over battlefields reported seeing vast swaths of burning coalition armor, often bearing the distinctive, deep penetration marks left by the Thunderbolt's 76mm gun. Enemy infantry, seeing their armored protectors so easily dispatched, often broke and ran, even before the Thunderbolts could engage them directly. Commanders on the coalition side were forced to issue new directives, advising their tank crews to prioritize targeting the swift, lightly armored Thunderbolts, acknowledging them as the primary threat. This, in turn, often led to coalition tanks exposing their own flanks in desperate attempts to engage the elusive Thunderbolt, playing directly into the Allied hunter-killers' hands. The logistical advantages of the Thunderbolt were also significant. Its relatively lighter construction meant it could traverse terrain that bogged down heavier tanks, and its impressive fuel economy allowed for longer operational ranges without constant resupply. Spare parts, though always in demand, were often easier to manufacture and transport due to a more streamlined design philosophy. It wasn't just a powerful weapon, it was an efficient weapon, a critical factor in a war of attrition. The crews themselves, often young and audacious, developed a profound bond with their machines. They understood the risks of their thin armor but reveled in the thrill of the hunt, seeing themselves as the elite shock troops of the armored corps. They painted intricate, stylized Thunderbolts or Wraith Hunter insignias on their vehicles, a defiant challenge to the enemy. These were the true masters of armored warfare, at least in the crucible of this conflict. Their exploits filled newspapers and fueled morale, making them heroes in an era desperate for them. They were the reason the Goliath stopped being an invincible force and became merely a target. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As the great global conflict wore on, the strategic landscape began to shift, and with it, the needs of the Allied forces. While the Thunderbolt had proven itself an unparalleled tank destroyer, its specialized nature began to highlight certain limitations as the war progressed into different phases. The initial desperate need to counter overwhelming enemy armor slowly gave way to offensive operations, deep penetrations into enemy territory, urban combat, and supporting infantry in clearing fortified positions. In these scenarios, the Thunderbolt's thin armor, a deliberate design choice for speed and firepower, became a significant vulnerability. Street fighting, for instance, exposed its open-top turret to snipers, artillery shrapnel, and even Molotov cocktails from above, often incapacitating crews. Its powerful gun, while excellent for punching through armor, lacked the explosive power of larger-caliber howitzers needed for demolishing bunkers or suppressing entrenched infantry effectively. The command staff, looking ahead to the eventual push into the enemy's heartland, began to envision a different kind of armored warfare. They needed vehicles that could not only engage enemy tanks but also lead infantry assaults, withstand sustained fire, and provide heavy, all-purpose support. This led to a resurgence in the development and deployment of more heavily armored, conventional tanks. The new Vanguard heavy tank, for example, boasted significantly thicker armor and a dual-purpose gun capable of both anti-tank and anti-infantry roles. While slower and less agile than the Thunderbolt, its survivability in prolonged engagements and its versatility in a wider range of combat scenarios made it increasingly attractive to planners. The doctrine was shifting from pure tank hunting to a more generalized combined arms approach, where a single armored vehicle could fulfill multiple roles on the battlefield. Furthermore, the enemy's own tactics were evolving. Coalition forces, having suffered terribly at the hands of the Thunderbolts, began to adapt. They deployed more infantry-supported anti-tank teams, utilized mines extensively, and initiated ambushes in constricted terrain where the Thunderbolt's speed advantage was negated. The element of surprise, so crucial to the Thunderbolt's success, became harder to achieve. While the Thunderbolt continued to excel in its niche role of targeted armored engagement, the demand for this specific, singular capability began to wane relative to the broader requirements of the advancing Allied armies. The logistical tail, too, became a factor. Maintaining a diverse fleet of specialized vehicles, each with its own unique parts and training requirements, was increasingly seen as an inefficiency. Standardization became a keyword, pushing for multi-role platforms that could simplify supply chains and maintenance. Even within the Thunderbolt crews themselves, a subtle shift occurred. While they remained fiercely proud of their machines, the constant exposure to the dangers of their light armor and increasingly varied combat environments took its toll. The vulnerability of the open-top turret was a persistent concern. The high casualty rates amongst Thunderbolt crews, though often balanced by their high kill counts, contributed to a re-evaluation at the highest levels. The question slowly transitioned from how effective is it at killing tanks, to how versatile and survivable is it across all potential combat scenarios. And in that broader assessment, the Thunderbolt, despite its legendary prowess, began to show its age, not in terms of capability, but in terms of its singular purpose in an evolving conflict. It was a victim of its own success, a specialized tool made for a very specific problem that was slowly being replaced by new, broader challenges. The tide of battle had decisively turned, and the focus of the Allied command was rapidly shifting from achieving tactical victories to planning for long-term strategic peace and global restructuring. In this new environment, the Thunderbolt found itself facing an enemy more insidious and pervasive than the coalition's heavy armor, the post-war budget. The end of major hostilities did not mean an end to military expenditure. In fact, it spurred a feverish re-evaluation of every existing weapon system under the banner of standardization and efficiency. High-ranking officials in the newly formed Department of Defense, many of whom had never smelled powder smoke, saw the Thunderbolt not as a legendary hero, but as an expensive anomaly. A specialized committee, informally known as the Axe Committee, was formed to streamline the armed forces. Their mandate was simple: eliminate non-standard, single-purpose equipment. The Thunderbolt, designed solely for tank killing, became an immediate target. Its very strengths, its high-velocity gun and unique chassis, were now framed as weaknesses. Too specialized, too fragile, too expensive to maintain a unique supply chain, was the recurring refrain in committee memos. The argument was made that since the Vanguard heavy tank could perform both anti-tank and direct fire support, the thousands of Thunderbolts represented redundant capacity. Why maintain separate training programs, spare parts depots, and maintenance manuals for a tank destroyer when a general-purpose tank could do almost as well? The crew members and field commanders who had relied on the Thunderbolt's lethal efficiency argued passionately for its retention. They presented mountains of data showcasing its unparalleled kill-to-loss ratio against the coalition's hardest targets. They pointed out that while the Vanguard was better at infantry support, it was too slow to execute the lightning-fast defensive maneuvers the Thunderbolt was famous for. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The voices of those who knew the machine best were drowned out by the roar of calculators and the dictates of efficiency. General Alistair Vance, a leading proponent of the combined arms doctrine and a powerful voice on the Axe Committee, successfully pushed the narrative that the next war would not be fought by specialist vehicles, but by versatile, heavily protected platforms. His vision was a unified armored corps where complexity was replaced by uniformity. Furthermore, a political factor played a subtle but important role: turf wars. The conventional armored corps, led by powerful figures favoring the slower, heavier Vanguard tanks, saw the successful, independently operated Thunderbolt battalions as an unwelcome rival for resources and prestige. By eliminating the Thunderbolt, they could consolidate power, funds, and personnel under the banner of the General Purpose Tank Division. The decision was not purely military or logistical, it was a cold, calculated move of institutional self-preservation. In a quiet directive issued in late 1947, the Thunderbolt was declared obsolete and its remaining operational units were ordered to stand down. A weapon that won the war was, for all intents and purposes, being erased from the active roster by the very bureaucracy it had fought to protect. Its fate, once glorious, was now sealed by ledger sheets and political maneuvering. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bureaucratic decision to retire the Thunderbolt quickly translated into a stunningly efficient process of mass disposal. What followed was one of the largest and most rapid scrap operations in military history. Thousands of Thunderbolts, many of which had served with distinction in crucial battles, were shunted to massive holding yards, such as the infamous depot at Fort Callahan and the rail yard near Silver Lake. The order was to demilitarize and dispose of them, with overwhelming haste. The sheer volume of machinery meant there was little room for sentimentality or preservation. The process was brutal. Cannons were cut with torches, rendering the main weapon useless. Engines and transmissions were pulled for salvage or sold as surplus on the civilian market, often ending up in logging trucks or agricultural machinery. The distinct, thin armored hulls were crushed or melted down, their high-quality steel eagerly absorbed by the nation's booming post-war construction industry. This rapid dismantling served multiple purposes for the High Command. It immediately freed up valuable storage space, generated a quick return on investment for the Treasury, and, perhaps most crucially, prevented any future attempt by field commanders or political rivals to resurrect the program. The goal was total, irreversible elimination. While the majority were scrapped, a significant number of the stripped-down hulls were sold as military surplus to various Allied nations seeking to quickly modernize their own forces, often at rock-bottom prices. These vehicles, however, were delivered without their crucial high-velocity guns, receiving instead less powerful, general-purpose weapons. They were no longer the Wraith Hunters, but merely fast, lightly armored utility vehicles, forever neutered of their original, deadly capability. This dispersal further ensured that the original Thunderbolt design, the perfect synthesis of speed and anti-tank lethality, would never be seen again in a unified, operational capacity. The true tragedy of the dismantling lay in the loss of institutional knowledge. As the Thunderbolts were scrapped, the highly specialized hunter-killer battalions were deactivated. The crews, the masters of the shoot and scoot doctrine, were either reassigned to slower Vanguard units, where their skills were marginalized, or simply discharged. Their unique tactical experience, developed through years of intense combat, was not formally documented or integrated into the new combined arms manuals. It was lost to time, considered irrelevant by the proponents of the new, standardized armored fleet. A collective memory of effective, specialized warfare was intentionally allowed to dissipate. The legacy of the Thunderbolt was not just removed from the battlefield, it was actively scrubbed from the history books being written by the new defense establishment, paving the way for the myth that only heavily armored, multi-purpose tanks could win a modern war. The final, and most ironic, chapter of the Thunderbolt story was written a few years after its retirement, on the sun-baked plains of the Sultanate of Zephyr. A new, localized conflict flared up, rapidly escalating into a proxy war against a regional power supplied and supported by the same Eastern coalition that had been defeated in the Great Global Conflict. This time, the coalition introduced a new generation of their armored beast, the Cyclone medium tank. While lighter than the old Goliath, the Cyclone utilized advanced composite armor and a low profile, making it deceptively tough and highly resistant to the standard rounds fired by the dominant Allied Vanguard tanks. The Vanguard, built for general versatility, struggled immensely. Its lower velocity gun, designed for dual-purpose effectiveness, failed to consistently penetrate the Cyclone's improved frontal armor. Field reports quickly detailed alarming losses. The Vanguards were too slow to effectively maneuver around the Cyclones, and their attempts to engage them often resulted in them taking devastating hits before they could achieve a flank shot. The doctrine of combined arms, so vaunted by General Vance in the Axe Committee, was proving fatally inadequate against a specialized, modern armored threat. The Allies suddenly found themselves back in the grim situation of the early war, outgunned and outmaneuvered by superior enemy armor. It was in this desperate moment that field commanders began to whisper the forbidden name, the Thunderbolt. They remembered its 76mm high-velocity gun, the perfect counter to the very problem they now faced. They realized that the specialization they had discarded was exactly what the battlefield demanded. Frantic messages were relayed back to Central Command, pleading for the retrieval of any remaining Thunderbolt chassis or the immediate development of a similar high-velocity tank destroyer. But it was too late. The decommissioning had been too thorough. The blueprints for the specialized ammunition were filed away, the production lines were retooled for Vanguard parts, and the few holes that remained were either halfway around the world or stripped beyond repair. The institutional knowledge was gone. The Axe Committee's efficiency had created a critical capability gap. The Allies had the infantry, the air support, and the logistics, but they lacked the specific hard-kill vehicle necessary to destroy the enemy's main battle tank efficiently. The ghosts of the scrapped Thunderbolts haunted every destroyed Vanguard hull on the Zephyr plains, a grim testament to the fact that while a generalist can handle many problems passably, only a specialist can handle a critical problem decisively. Underscore 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 underscore. The losses in the Sultanate of Zephyr forced a stark and painful realization within the upper echelons of the Allied command. The specialized tank destroyer had been vital, and its abandonment was a profound mistake, driven by short-sighted peacetime economics and inter-service rivalry. In the wake of the Cyclone crisis, the military was compelled to belatedly develop a new dedicated tank killer, a project that took years and billions of dollars to complete, all to replace a capability that had been perfectly functional and readily available just years earlier. The new vehicle, eventually designated the M41 Spearhead, was in essence a heavier, modernized reincarnation of the Thunderbolt's core philosophy, a focus on high-velocity firepower and speed. The legacy of the Thunderbolt, therefore, is not merely a tale of a weapon retired, but a powerful cautionary example in military planning. It illustrates the danger of applying peacetime accounting logic to wartime necessity. The Axe Committee had looked at the Thunderbolt's cost and uniqueness and found it wanting. The battlefield, however, had valued its decisive performance and lethal specialization. The lesson learned, at the cost of Allied lives and strategic ground in Zephyr, was that standardization should never trump capability. But the story holds another, more profound insight, the psychological cost of specialization. For many in the post-war leadership, the tank destroyer concept was a painful reminder of the humiliating early days of the Great Global Conflict, when their traditional heavy armor had failed spectacularly against the Goliath. The Thunderbolt, though victorious, was born of desperation and compromise, its thin armor, its open top. By embracing the slower, more conventional Vanguard, the leadership was not just embracing efficiency, they were subconsciously embracing a return to the comfort of traditional armored doctrine: big, protected, and multi-purpose. Scrapping the Thunderbolt was a way to symbolically close the door on the era of desperate improvisation and vulnerability. Today, only a handful of original, fully intact Thunderbolts exist, mostly in private collections or stripped, silent displays in museums. They stand as quiet monuments to a fundamental strategic oversight. They remind us that the best weapon is not necessarily the most versatile or the most expensive, but the one perfectly tailored to kill the single greatest threat on the battlefield. The question lingers: how many resources, and how many lives, could have been saved in subsequent conflicts had the lessons learned on the Western Front been valued more than the spreadsheets drafted in the quiet halls of power? The Thunderbolt didn't lose the war, it won it, and then was defeated by the very victory it secured. Now, for the twist, the final piece of the puzzle that explains why this legendary machine was not just abandoned, but almost vanished. While the official reasons, budget, standardization, and doctrinal shift, were genuine factors, they obscure a hidden, technical secret about the Thunderbolt's ultimate fate: the ammunition crisis. The 76mm high-velocity gun of the Thunderbolt was effective only because it utilized a highly specialized, tungsten-cored armor-piercing round known as the Silver Bullet. This projectile was incredibly effective at defeating the Goliath's hardened steel, but its production was complex, expensive, and relied on a massive, singular stockpile of high-grade, conflict-sourced tungsten that was largely depleted by the war's end. The production of the Silver Bullet was a wartime miracle, never truly optimized for mass peacetime manufacturing. When the Axe Committee conducted its audit, they found that while the Thunderbolt chassis could theoretically be maintained, the ability to produce the specific ammunition that made it a panzer killer was functionally impossible without restarting the entire, prohibitively expensive wartime supply chain for a scarce material. The Vanguard tanks, by contrast, used a more common, larger caliber shell that could be mass-produced cheaply with abundant post-war materials. The leadership had a choice: invest billions in re-establishing the unique tungsten supply and manufacturing base just for the Thunderbolt's specialized round, or scrap the Thunderbolt and consolidate resources around the cheaper, mass-producible Vanguard ammunition. They chose the latter, concluding that a Thunderbolt without the Silver Bullet was just a fast, lightly armored target. The bureaucracy didn't just retire the tank, they retired the ammunition that defined it, making the vehicle itself functionally useless for its intended purpose. This truth was deliberately downplayed in official reports. It was politically easier to blame obsolescence and standardization than to admit the nation had critically depleted a strategic resource, tungsten, in the rush of war, thus hamstringing their best tank killer in peacetime. The final irony is that the Thunderbolt was too good. Its lethal efficiency was tied to a rare resource that made its continued existence financially impossible. It wasn't just a political decision, it was an economic and material reality. The Thunderbolt was abandoned not because it was defeated by the enemy, but because it ran out of the magic bullet that made it invincible. Its incredible success was literally the reason for its demise. If the story of the Thunderbolt's tungsten bullet twist surprised you, hit the like button and share this with someone who loves military history. We spent weeks digging up the official documents to bring you this story. Tell me in the comments, do you think the military made the right call by prioritizing cost over a unique capability? Don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten history. The Thunderbolt's official erasure was met with fierce, quiet resistance from the people who knew the vehicle best, the veterans and the engineers who had created and crewed them. They couldn't fight the generals or the accountants in Washington, but they launched a private, desperate campaign for preservation and remembrance. This wasn't a fight to return the Thunderbolt to active service, they knew that battle was lost, but a struggle to save a handful of examples from the scrap torch and ensure the machine's legacy was not completely obliterated. Leading this charge was a former engineer named Elias Vance and a retired Thunderbolt squadron commander, Major Reynolds. Vance, who had helped design the sophisticated torsion bar suspension, used his remaining contacts within the massive Commonwealth Automotive Corporation to track down chassis that had been slated for the scrap heap but had not yet been fully demilitarized. Major Reynolds, with his vast network of wartime comrades, orchestrated a grassroots effort, raising funds through veteran organizations and small, anonymous donors. Their goal was audacious: to purchase, restore, and preserve a handful of Thunderbolts in their original, lethal configuration, including the highly coveted 76mm high-velocity gun. The process was a bureaucratic nightmare laced with outright deception. The surplus regulations demanded that all sales be demilitarized, often meaning the main gun was sawed off. Vance and Reynolds resorted to buying stripped-down hulls as agricultural equipment or heavy movers, then secretly sourcing original, intact cannons through black market military channels run by disillusioned former ordnance officers. They faced constant harassment from the official military auditors who were determined to close out the Thunderbolt program completely. On several occasions, shipments of their purchased hulls were inexplicably diverted back to official scraping yards, forcing Reynolds to personally intervene, sometimes leveraging old combat debts and even making thinly veiled threats to expose corrupt practices within the surplus sales division. Their efforts often resulted in near misses. They managed to acquire 3 intact hulls from the Silver Lake Depot just hours before the cutters arrived. One of their most prized acquisitions, a Thunderbolt nicknamed the Ghost of Ardennes, which held the highest confirmed number of coalition tank kills, was discovered rusting in a forgotten corner of an ordnance depot in the distant territory of New Georgia. It took 6 months of legal maneuvering, including exploiting a clerical error in the disposal paperwork, before they could secure its release. They then had to clandestinely move the historic vehicle across 4 state lines, often using false identification and covering the tank under massive tarps labeled heavy farm machinery. Vance and Reynolds established a small, private museum and restoration workshop near the quiet town of Willow Creek. Here, away from the prying eyes of the Defense Department, they painstakingly restored the tanks, fabricating replacement parts for the unique running gear and even going so far as to machine non-firing dummy versions of the silver bullet ammunition to display in the racks. Their work was not just mechanical, it was an act of historical defiance. They collected testimonies, photographs, and operational manuals, creating a comprehensive record of the Thunderbolt's true effectiveness, a counter-narrative to the official story of obsolescence. This small, private collection became a pilgrimage site for veterans, a place where the glory and the heartbreak of the Wraith Hunter lived on, protected by the dedication of those who refused to let history be erased by budgetary fiat. The efforts of individuals like Elias Vance and Major Reynolds ensured the physical survival of a few Thunderbolts, but the true battle was one of historical narrative. For decades, the official military history continued to champion the Vanguard and the subsequent, heavier armored designs. The Thunderbolt was relegated to a footnote, a useful but ultimately flawed transitional design. This deliberate downplaying had significant, if unintended, consequences for future military planning, as the true lessons of the Wraith Hunter doctrine were systematically ignored. The fundamental insight of the Thunderbolt, that speed, surprise, and specialized high-velocity firepower can defeat sheer mass and armor, was forgotten. Future weapons systems prioritized protection and versatility, resulting in increasingly heavy, complex, and expensive vehicles. This adherence to the bigger is better philosophy led directly to strategic vulnerabilities and later, lesser-known conflicts. For instance, in the border skirmishes of the Northern Delta in the late 1960s, Allied forces again faced a new, fast, and agile enemy tank, the Cobra, utilized by insurgent forces. These Cobras used hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the slow reaction time and high operational cost of the heavy Allied main battle tanks that were direct descendants of the Vanguard doctrine. The failure to retain the Thunderbolt concept meant the Allied forces had to hastily adapt infantry-portable anti-tank weapons and rely heavily on air support, incurring massive logistical costs and risking unnecessary casualties. The specific need for a light, rapid, and deadly ground-based counter-armor vehicle was once again painfully evident. Military historians and analysts who studied the conflict pointed to the uncanny parallels with the early days of the Great Global Conflict, a situation the Thunderbolt had been specifically designed to prevent. The bureaucratic victory of the Axe Committee was a strategic defeat played out decades later. Elias Vance, speaking at a small gathering of history enthusiasts at his Willow Creek workshop in the 1970s, articulated this tragedy best: they threw away the Thunderbolt because it didn't fit their budget line items. But what they really discarded was a philosophy of maneuver warfare. We proved you don't need thick armor if you can hit first and move fast. The heavy tank doctrine they enforced forced our crews to fight a static, reactive war against enemies who had learned to fight a dynamic one. The true cost of scrapping the Thunderbolt isn't the price of the steel, it's the cost of relearning a lesson in blood that we had already paid for. His words and the silent presence of his restored Thunderbolt served as a constant, if unofficial, warning for the future. Eventually, a new generation of military thinkers, unburdened by the institutional biases of the post-war era, began to study the archived records and the private materials gathered by Vance and Reynolds. They rediscovered the brilliance of the Thunderbolt's high-velocity gun and its doctrine. This rediscovery would, decades later, inspire the eventual design of the M41 Spearhead, mentioned in Part 7, finally vindicating the original Wraith Hunter concept. The Thunderbolt's final contribution to the nation it saved was not on the battlefield, but as a ghost from the past, guiding its successors towards a better, more lethal future. The story of the Thunderbolt ultimately culminates not in its defeat by the enemy, but in the vindication of its core principle. Decades after its wholesale scrapping, the Allied High Command officially acknowledged the historical error. The catastrophic lessons learned in Zephyr and the Northern Delta finally forced a critical self-assessment. The resulting M41 Spearhead program, while technologically advanced, was philosophically a direct tribute to the Thunderbolt. It married speed, high mobility, and a potent, high-velocity cannon designed specifically for dedicated anti-armor roles. The long-lost shoot-and-scoot doctrine was officially revived and implemented. This technological return was accompanied by a rehabilitation of the Thunderbolt's historical honor. Prompted by the tireless efforts of veterans groups and the publication of Vance's comprehensive historical record, the Defense Department quietly moved to correct the record. Ceremonies were held at Fort Callahan and Silver Lake, acknowledging the critical, specialized role of the Thunderbolt. While the official reason for decommissioning remained clouded in euphemisms about logistical optimization, the public narrative shifted from one of obsolete scrap to one of pioneering brilliance. In a powerful symbolic gesture, the one remaining operational Thunderbolt, the Ghost of Ardennes, restored by Vance and Reynolds, was acquired by the National Armored Museum and placed on prominent display. It was intentionally situated not amongst the dusty exhibits of long-forgotten relics, but alongside the sleek, modern M41 Spearhead, with a plaque that clearly designated the Thunderbolt as the conceptual ancestor of the new fleet. The inscription detailed its unparalleled success against the Goliath and obliquely referenced the strategic error of its abandonment, finally giving the veterans the recognition they fought so hard for. But the most potent legacy of the Thunderbolt remains the hidden truth of the silver bullet and the tungsten crisis. This detail, the reality that its success was financially unsustainable, serves as the final, most chilling warning. It taught military planners that reliance on a single, strategically scarce resource, no matter how effective, introduces a fatal fragility into a weapon system. Future specialized weapons were designed with redundancy in mind, ensuring multiple, easily sourced ammunition types could deliver comparable performance. The Thunderbolt's final, greatest contribution was forcing the military to think beyond the immediate battlefield and consider the global supply chain as an integral part of weapon effectiveness. The story is a powerful reminder that history is often written not by the heroes who fight the war, but by the bureaucracies that pay for it. The Thunderbolt was abandoned not out of a lack of respect, and certainly not out of military failure, but because its design pushed the material and economic boundaries of its time. It remains a legend, the true American panzer killer that won the biggest fight, only to be defeated, years later, by a spreadsheet and a shortage of a rare metal. Its silence in the post-war years speaks louder than any heavy tank's roar, a timeless echo warning against the dangers of prioritizing short-term economy over long-term, specialized capability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.